Hey everyone, we are excited to launch the Bright Mind subscription. Unlimited access to all of our CE courses, webinars, and expert speakers all in one place.
And for a limited time for the month of December, you can get 50% off. Normally $299 a year, now just $149 for your first year.
That's unlimited CE on your schedule for half price.
Head over to psych2practice.com and click sign up, and the discount is already applied. We look forward to seeing you there. And as always, be well, stay psyched. This episode of the Psych to Practice podcast is sponsored by PAR, where psychological assessments meet innovation.
PAR has been the gold standard in the industry for over 45 years and has empowered professionals in education, healthcare, private practice, and research with trusted tools and cutting-edge solutions.
Discover more at parinc.com. Again, that is parinc.com. Creating connections, changing lives. Hello and welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and joining me as always,
Ray Christner.
And, we had a pleasure of, that's not how we had a great opportunity to talk with a guest about a topic that, I think is really well known, but I don't know that we've covered it yet on the podcast, focusing on, his book on DBT here.
Yeah. So Jesse Finkelstein, was someone who I actually didn't know prior to chatting with him about being a guest on the podcast. But what really kind of captured me was the book that we talked about tonight, which is called Real Skills for Real Life. And I think for me, what was so great about this book and kind of made me interested in having him on was the fact that he takes something that we think of as this intense therapy and just brings it into our everyday lives. So for all of us, so not only, as a treatment, but how do we just live well with using some of these strategies? So this was a fun conversation today.
And I think something that got caught up multiple times is not only taking the information and making it accessible, but also, given a bit of his background, really making it engaging with some of the illustrations and some of the designs and, charts. And, I think you call out there at the very end of the episode, Ray, like how it might be some of the best design work in terms of a book. And so check it out just for even that, like the functionality and having some like really great resources there. Yeah.
I love when I read something and then there's just some visual or something that just brings it to life. And, I've been lucky to do training in DBT. And when I read it, I gained so much. And just some little, like I said, these illustrations, which I think I do talk about throughout the episode, is really, they were cool for me to see because I was like, oh, wow, this will make sense for not only the adults I see. I actually think the illustrations would be great for some of the adolescents I work with. And I know that's not the target of the book, but we're going to be bridging into that in my clinical work. So it was good.
And for those of you that aren't familiar, Dr. Jesse Finkelstein is a clinical psychologist and illustrator, as well as the founder of Access Psychological Services and the co-founder of TheraHive, an online platform for DBT learning. Jesse is the co-author of Real Skills for Real Life, as well as the creator of The Game of Real Life. His illustrations and animation design have supported federally funded research in disseminating therapeutic interventions.
Yeah. And again, just a shout out for the book, Real Skills for Real Life, DBT for Everyday Living. And it's Dr. Jesse Finkelstein. And also just to call out his co-author for the book, Dr. Shireen Rizvi, who also contributed, couldn't be on the show today, but those in the DBT world, I'm sure, have been familiar with her work in other areas.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, Real Skills for Real Life, a DBT guide for navigating stress, emotions, and relationships.
So Jesse, welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast. We're so glad you could spend some time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to talk a little bit about your book that came out at the end of last year, and really kind of diving a little bit into DBT, which I think is always interesting for our listeners. So we appreciate you coming on. We like to start with kind of getting the origin story of our guests so that our listeners get to know a little bit about you other than the formal bio that we're going to read. So can you tell us just a little bit about how you got into psychology first, and then how that led you to some expertise in DBT?
Absolutely. I think I'm what they call, or maybe I just invented this term, a mid-career psychologist. So I went back to school for psychology around 35. And prior to that, I was doing sort of lots of work at the intersection of technology and design. That was sort of my interest. Everything from user interface, illustration, graphic, textile, like sort of all types of design. And while in many ways I found that work incredibly meaningful, it felt like something was really missing, oftentimes sort of like the immediacy of one-to-one connection. And I wanted to do something that felt like I was in more of service in some way. And that led me back to graduate school for psychology.
So your first job was more tech space, is that?
Yeah, like design and tech. Like I was doing lots of design work. Yeah.
So that is a real switch.
It was a real switch. Let me tell you, it had been a long time. I was 35. So the last time I was in school was 20,
right?
Whatever. It was a real switch. I think as a designer, you are thinking about psychology, but there's not necessarily a lot of language around it. And I think there was a part of me that knew that I was missing that. Like I wanted a language, a way of organizing my thoughts in the world. And, I had always, while I didn't study psychology as an undergrad, I'm someone who has experienced therapy and was familiar with psychology and had always been interested in it. And in my mind, I was like, okay, perhaps pursuing psychology could do two things for me. One, it could sort of give me a language and a way of thinking about the world. And two, perhaps it could give me tools and skills that could be helpful for others. And when I went back to school for psychology, in my mind, I was like, okay, my life in design is over. Like now I'm a psychologist. And I think partly as evidenced by this book, that has not turned out to be the case.
Right. Well, and if I am correct, you've done a game as well. Is that right? Like there's some game development in your past?
Yeah. So this interesting thing happened, which is I went back to school for clinical psychology. And one thing that I discovered and that my mentor and co-author of this book, Dr. Shireen Rizvi, and I sort of reflected on is that psychologists are really excellent at developing treatments that work. We've got all sorts of treatments that can help with emotion dysregulation, anxiety, depression. And we're not always great at making those treatments things that people desire, things that they want to engage with and use. And so I began to sort of put my designer hat on. And this is at the time where I began to work at Shireen. At the time was a professor at Rutgers where I was a graduate student and had a DBT lab. And to metabolize the skills, the DBT skills, all this information, I began to illustrate them. And then from that emerged this game with the idea of can we sort of gamify sort of learning DBT skills as another tool of engagement? Right. So that this activity, rather than being a pill we know we need to swallow, actually becomes something that people want to play. And so from there, all sorts of things sort of evolved. Shireen and I did a series of animated videos during COVID for a large study. I began to work with other clinicians on their projects, doing animated videos and illustrations. So now I've found myself at this weird intersection of both being a clinician and having my own research interests, as well as benefiting from other clinicians who want to hire me to do illustration, graphic design, and that sort of thing.
And now a word from our sponsor. PAR's AI Report Writer is an AI-boosted tool that generates comprehensive reports, including interpretations and recommendations based on scores from a wide range of popular assessment tools. Spend less time on report writing and more time supporting students. Learn more at parinc.com/AI. That is parinc.com/AI. And now back to our conversation.
That's kind of a cool way to merge your two fields. That's great. So that's kind of a good lead in. So we're going to talk about your book, and what I think is kind of interesting is when I think of DBT and I think about books around DBT, I think about skills books. I think about, things that are, like you said, strategies that work, these evidence-based strategies. And what really kind of I found interested in your book, and it's kind of in the title, is this is really about just real life, right? It's like very practical, hands-on. This isn't just a bunch of worksheets kind of book. So I guess I'm interested in, when the two of you were thinking about this book, what inspired you to go in this direction with DBT?
It really was this collaboration we did around these animated videos, which, folks can find. It's on the DBTRU YouTube channel. It has something like, 2 million views so far.
Oh, wow.
What we learned from that experience is that there's a huge appetite for these skills delivered in a fun, playful way. I think the other thing that we were reflecting on is that these are skills that we as clinicians practice that have shown to be immeasurably beneficial for the clients that we work with. And it's, we were like everyone should be aware of these skills. And one thing I want to say, the brilliance of Marsha Linehan, who developed DBT, is that in many ways she was gathering all of these different types of CBT and behavioral treatments under the umbrella of DBT, these treatments that had been sort of road tested, and then sort of articulated them in such a brilliant way to deliver them to clients that, these are skills for everyone,
And, Jesse, as we're talking about this and we're talking about DBT, if there's individuals that are listening and they're like, I've heard of DBT, but I don't actually know what DBT is. Like, would you mind kind of breaking it down a little bit for them? And just so that way we're all going to have that same language here.
Absolutely. DBT stands for dialectical behavior therapy. And it was developed by Marsha Linehan in the 1980s, initially to treat folks who presented with chronic suicidal behaviors and non-suicidal self-interest behaviors. Oftentimes, this was under the umbrella diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Since then, it is the premier evidence-based treatment for BPD. And since then, it has been shown to be effective for a range of different disorders, everything from treatment-resistant depression to binge eating disorder. And it's based on sort of two philosophical umbrellas. And Paul, I don't want to bore any of your listeners. Let me know if it would be helpful for me to dive into any of that, or whatever.
I think giving a little bit more just helps to really ground the theory into the practicality that we're going to be getting into here.
So with that invitation, I'm going to run with it. And at some point, you let me know if I've gone too far.
I'll start waving down.
Fabulous. So first, there is this very heavy word, dialectics or dialectical, which I for a lot of people might bring them back to their college philosophy seminar classes or what have you. Fundamentally, what the dialectical philosophy represents is that two opposing truths can exist simultaneously. So for instance, and this is something like a way that we often present it to folks in DBT, you're doing the best that you can and you need to do better. the two truths there is, given your learning history, given your biology, given all the things that you know and have come before, you're doing the literal best that you can in this moment. And the other truth that we can hold, you need to change, work harder, be more effective, or behave more effectively. So from that sort of understanding that two truths can exist simultaneously, a number of other sort of assumptions that come out of that. One is, all behavior, all sort of things are connected in some way, that we're in constant transaction with our environment, that relationships are, I'm going to pause right here. Let me come back for 1 second. Yeah. So from that, a number of important sort of assumptions emerge. Like one assumption is that the nature of interconnectedness, how I affect you affects me, and that there is a transactional, I don't mean transaction like handing over cash money, but like a dynamic that exists between all people, all things. And that there is a interrelatedness, meaning that we're all connected in this way. Another assumption is that truth is ever evolving, that we can sort of hold two opposing truths at the same time. And from that, a synthesis will emerge. And that synthesis will then create its own antithesis, which will then need to be resolved into its new synthesis. So truth is ever evolving. Now, I'm sure a lot of folks are listening are like, wait, like, why is this helpful? Or maybe some of you are like, oh yeah, I've been cured of my anxiety, dialectics. I imagine other folks are like, wait. So a number of this is meaningful for emotion regulation. This is meaningful for human suffering for a number of reasons. One is that when we're attached to a single truth, when we become inflexible, that can cause a lot of problems. It can cause us to begin to feel isolated from one another. It might make it difficult for us to see other people's perspective and can create conflict in our lives. It can also leave out a lot of important information. So for instance, it's like we go through the world almost like seeing our world through like a pinhole based on our experience, based on our skills, based on our learning. Our brains are sort of constructing this experience, and sort of dialectics is constantly asking us, okay, what are we leaving out? How can we dilate that pinhole into something bigger and begin to sort of relate to our environment more flexibly? So folks from other, lineages of CBT, like, cognitive flexibility. So thinking dialectically means to think flexibly. And it's also a flexibility in holding on to what we believe to be true, knowing that it's ephemeral, knowing that change is constant. How can I begin to both accept where I am and make movement towards what's effective for me? So I'll pause right there. Any questions, thoughts, reflections?
It does make me want, like, when you're talking through these pieces, that translation of these large concepts that really try to then how like distilling that down into just and even in general, the practical skill the DBT is kind of, that it's known for is that, how effective it can be. And yet kind of starting from some of these concepts that I think can be, maybe at times overwhelming or at times just hard to grasp. And when you're working with this, like these core pieces, how important are they for individuals working to benefit from DBT to fully grasp and fully lean into, as well as the clinicians that are listening in, to develop a better understanding for themselves to better connect and contribute these skills to the clients that they're working with, or encourage others to like pick the book up and, maybe be a tool for them to like reflect back into?
I love that question. And it's funny that you asked that, because we just submitted a clinical roundtable for ABCT to talk about how dialectics is helpful for all CBT clinicians, not just for DBT therapists. And I would say a couple of things to that. I think first, DBT, and I'll step back for a second. The treatment itself is, there are different modes of delivering DBT. The DBT skills themselves cover 4 different modules. There's mindfulness, which is the foundation of DBT. There's emotion regulation, so how to reduce our vulnerability to unwanted emotion, and when unwanted emotion shows up, how to engage with it effectively. There is interpersonal effectiveness, so how to get our needs and goals met and also maintain our important relationships and self-respect. And then there is distress tolerance. So how do I get through crisis situations without engaging in ineffective behaviors or behaviors that may hurt me in the long term? So those are the 4 sort of major modules that we're covering in DBT. Now, there is sort of like a secret module, not so secret. It's called Walking the Middle Path. And oftentimes that's taught in interpersonal effectiveness. And within that module, we are teaching dialectics. We're also teaching the principles of behaviorism. And so we're not necessarily spending a lot of time always going through, the intricacies of dialectics, and it is being woven throughout the treatment. It is always something that as a clinician, I am holding in mind when I'm working with a client and I notice that there is a fixedness that they have towards a particular perception of reality. Or when I notice that we're polarized, you, like the client, you're like really angry at yourself and think that you're a bad person. I'm over here thinking, oh my God, you gotta stop beating yourself up and love yourself. We're polarized now. I'm arguing my point. You're arguing your point. Okay, what is the synthesis here? What are we both missing? Okay, you behaved ineffectively and you can still accept and love yourself. All right. So the dialectics can be both understood as a skill as well as a disposition and a set of strategies. In fact, there are dialectical strategies that as clinicians we employ to help clients become more flexible.
Jesse, as you're kind of talking, we're using terms like treatment, and where I think many people that in the world of Google, they search DBT and they hear things like borderline personality disorder and all of these things. I'm kind of interested in your thoughts about what about people who are not in therapy? What about people who maybe don't identify that they're struggling with mental health problems? How can you tell us a little bit about how you see DBT fitting in? Again, kind of going back to this idea of real life. Like, so for most people, is there a way that we employ it beyond treatment?
Yeah, I like the way that and I'm going to screw this metaphor up because I'm not a car aficionado, but the way that I am in my mind, I often say is like DBT has been like road tested on some of the toughest terrain. Like this is a car that has been built to withstand some of the hardest and harshest environments. And, just like, I don't know, Ferrari builds their Formula One car and then takes from that technology that then gets sort of placed into other sort of more consumer driven cars. That's how I think about the DBT skills. Like when Marcia was developing these skills, like these were for folks who were experiencing intense suffering. And because we know it can work for folks who are experiencing acute suffering, we know that these skills can generalize for folks who might not be in such pain. So when we think about real skills for real life, that's partly one aspect that I'm holding in mind. I think the other aspect is that like and maybe there's actually maybe there is a study that exists out there and that I'm unfamiliar with, but like I, as a clinician, like DBT clinicians, like we are expected to practice these skills ourselves. So while I don't meet criteria for BPD, I do know what it is to suffer. I do experience problems in life. And I have found these skills to be helpful and beneficial. So maybe we've got like an N of 1, but and I know Shireen, so there's an N of 2. But between, like, we have seen how powerful these skills are at helping folks of all sorts of, pain navigate life.
Yeah, I think that's such an important piece because I think just, I know we're talking about DBT specifically, but, I always kind of say, yeah, why aren't we using them before it has to be this heavy terrain? Like, why aren't we just learning these skills? Maybe we should teach it in preschool, and we should start making this kind of just a way that we use life. And yeah, I had a case today when you were talking about the dialects. I was thinking of a person I was talking to who doesn't have borderline personality or anything of that nature, but we were talking about communication and the fact that you can be a good communicator and miscommunicate at the same time. And it was such a simple kind of thing because her perception was, I'm always a terrible communicator. No, like you're a very efficient communicator. And she does all of these things to prove it. But when you're mad at your husband, you might not do it that well. It just might. And those two truths can be there. And it was really interesting because it was something as simple as that was like this aha moment. And, I kind of go, I love when what we do becomes elegant, right? Like we're not trying it to be, but all of a sudden it was like, yeah, like that's right. Like I am a good communicator. Like, and it was just such a nice twist in our therapy and just something so simple. I think that's the elegance of it.
Yeah. Firstly, I love hearing, and yet like sometimes it is something just holding those quote unquote simple truths. Like I can do something effectively and at times I can do it ineffectively.
Right.
Like that truth is evolving and contextual. I do a lot of parent therapy or parent work.
Yeah.
And I was actually having this experience today where I was working with two parents who arrived really polarized. One parent's like, my kid should be doing this. The other parent's like, the kid should be doing this. And it was one of the most wonderful things to see through a process of facilitating sort of them validating each other's perspective, recognizing the truths, not necessarily agreeing, just recognizing their truths, slowly moving towards a synthesis. Because that's the other element about polarization. And I think like for your client, when we get stuck, when we get polarized or when we get really fixed on a specific truth, a lot of emotion dysregulation can happen. For your client who thinks, I'm a terrible communicator, well, I can imagine all sorts of difficult feelings coming up, shame, anxiety. Oh my God, I'm never going to communicate well. And I urge to withdraw. So by engaging in dialectical thinking and holding some of these thoughts and beliefs a little more loosely, well, then we can become a bit more flexible and maybe the emotion won't become so powerful.
And maybe to build off of that and really kind of when we're talking about the real skills for real life, what are some of the ways that maybe the areas of, real life that you see these skills being applied to, like the, 4 key areas, like what does that look like in day-to-day life that isn't, a pathologized mental health concern, but, a Thursday? What does that look like?
Absolutely. So the first module, the first set of skills that we teach are the mindfulness skills. Mindfulness within DBT and many other traditions is defined as, attending to the present moment without judgment and purposefully. And while maybe to some folks that might sound really simple, I and many other folks find it incredibly hard. It's very easy and I'll speak for myself, to judge things, good or bad, right or wrong. When we are practicing mindfulness, we're just noticing without necessarily responding. And to that question, Paul, like where this comes up really practically is I have maybe not the best relationship to the news right now. I'm picking up my phone pretty frequently throughout the day to check the news. I'm guessing every time I do, my cortisol levels are getting a little bit higher. I'm probably not helping my vulnerability to difficult emotions. And I'm pretty sure that in so doing, I'm probably keeping my stress levels somewhat more elevated. Because I don't know about you all, if you read the news, there's always something to get yourself a little stressed out about.
Yes.
So mindfulness becomes really helpful in this moment in that if I am aware of a behavior, then I can change it. I can't change what I'm not aware of. So if I can simply notice, okay, I'm noticing this urge. I'm noticing inside my body, maybe there's some, an experience of tension. I'm having the thought, I'm worried something's happening in the world or something, what have you. I can pause in that moment and I've got a choice. And I've got a choice whether or not I want to engage, for instance, with picking up my phone. So that's one practical place where these skills come in. And in DBT, we break the mindfulness out skills into what we call the what and how skills. So what you do when you're practicing mindfulness and how you do it. Would it be helpful for me to sort of talk about in the other modules as well?
Yeah. That would be great.
Absolutely. So in the distress tolerance skills, and I feel like these are oftentimes the skills that perhaps like DBT is most famous for, in particular, the tip skills. Tipping the temperature, I feel like is a popular one where people are like sort of doing it like an ice bucket challenge. But essentially the distress tolerance skills, they're composed of sort of two types. There's the crisis survival skills and there's the reality acceptance skills. And the crisis survival skills are really, as I mentioned earlier, getting through a crisis without making the situation worse. Now, I'm trying to think of the last time I found myself, I've got an example. I had a client session early one morning last week. And I get on the subway, as I mentioned, I come in from Brooklyn to New York. And about, halfway into my ride, the train just stops. And I like to give myself a little bit of time because things happen. I live in New York and the subway can sometimes be a little unreliable. We are sitting there for 20 minutes without moving. In that moment, I begin to notice my, physiological arousal, like my heart's beating faster. I'm sweating. I'm feeling more tense, right? Now, this is a painful situation without any immediate solution, right? Now, there's a world in which, I could, because that distress is so profound, maybe I'd want to engage in a crisis behavior. I'm trying to think of Paul, Ray, are there like ideas based on yourselves or other clients that you've worked with? Like what would be a crisis behavior? Like something that would sort of harm you in the long term, feeling all this distress, something that you would do in that situation.
In the situation if you were being on the
you're trapped on this subway, it's stuck. You've got this client, like you're feeling this surge of fear, anxiety, panic, anger. Like when that comes up, is there do you ever know, maybe my urge would be to kick out the subway window and jump onto the tracks and run. Who knows, right?
Well, but I even think maybe something as simple as taking it out on somebody else on the subway. Somebody doing something maybe annoying.
Ray,
but my reactions to.
Thank you. That is a much more within the realm of possibility than my, it just goes to show in terms of where our minds are going. But yes, one example of a crisis behavior would be to just lose it on that person who is listening to their iPhone without headphones,
great example.
So in that moment, the goal is to get through that situation without making it worse, because who knows, you're going to be trapped in the subway. It probably is not going to be the greatest look to get in a fight with somebody on it for whoever knows for how long. So the crisis survival skills are a series of skills that we practice to get through that moment. And there are the skills that we have, like the tip skills, which is literally about bringing down that physiological arousal really fast. So these are things that we can do very quickly, like paced breathing, paired muscle relaxation, intense exercise, and the tip skill, where we can drop our physiological arousal, activate our parasympathetic nervous system so that we are less overwhelmed. Mm. Then there are other skills like the distract skills, where we are literally practicing different means and modes of distraction, bringing our attention to something else. The goal isn't to necessarily make the situation better. If you feel better, great. That's fabulous. The goal is literally to not do the thing that's going to make the situation worse. So those are the distress. Yeah, Ray, please.
No, that's great. That's great. I want to maybe jump back for a second, because as you were talking, I was thinking back to a part of the book that kind of, I think, leads us to these skills.
Yeah.
But, and after I heard your intro about you were a designer prior, some of this now all makes sense to me now that I kind of like go back and went, oh yeah, that's why, but in the book, I think one of the things that I appreciated was very visually accessible, very easy to kind of do. And the thing when you were talking about some of these skills, and I was kind of going through, my thoughts was that, there were these flow charts, or I think you guys maybe have called them pathways.
Yes.
In the book. Yeah. Which were very visual, like this decision tree of yes and no. And then you get to the skill piece, or kind of what should you do in that situation. And the one that's sticking in my head, I think there was one on ruminating.
Yes.
That goes through, right? Which we hear all the time from people. But I guess maybe can you walk us through, or walk the listeners through these pathways and how it gets to that skill, the radical acceptance and the strategies themselves. But I thought what was so powerful to me was to see it visually and go, yeah, that's what happens in my head. Like that's, that's a good illustration. So can you talk through that a bit with us?
Yeah. So one of the things is that in DBT, there are a lot of skills. I mentioned there's 4 modules. I think there's something like over 60 skills. In the book, I think we did like something like around 30 skills. And that can be overwhelming for anyone, especially if you're in a moment of crisis or if you're ruminating or what have you. So what we designed in the book, we figured there's a couple ways that you can sort of engage with the book. One, you could read it front to back, have at it. Or what we did was we were looking at the 4 modules and we were thinking to ourselves, okay, what are types of experiences that sort of capture this module? So for instance, we have a pathway of I'm in a crisis. And to your point, Ray, like that pathway is a decision tree. And it asks you all sorts of questions about how overwhelming the emotion is. Can the problem be solved? And based on how you sort of walk through that, it will then land you on a skill that could be helpful. And so similarly, within sort of like the mindfulness related one, we have this one of rumination. So if you notice yourself ruminating, okay, based on a series of prompts that we ask, like these are various types of skills that you can then practice to resolve that experience of suffering. So we were thinking about really for users, people today, I think, want to engage with sort of materials and all sorts, and especially books. Like not everyone's going to have the time or patience to read something cover to cover. So if you just want to pick up this book and just goes directly to the thing that's going to be helpful for you in that moment, we wanted to make that easy for folks.
Yeah, it's I love it's interesting because I love when things that sound complex become simple. And it's and that's what I really liked about these pathways, and even just the questions that you all ask are just simple things. I mean, and it was, and I forget how many pathways you kind of had in there, but 4 of them. Yeah. So, but if people got the questions, they could apply them in many more scenarios. And so like, I think like simply things like, questions like, do your emotions fit the facts? Like yes or no? I think the one that made me laugh out loud was the one that is about, do you want to reduce your vulnerability in the future? And it's like, yes, please. And then it's like, no. And it's like, stay miserable. And I'm like, what great honesty, right? Like, it's like, hey, but it is a choice that we have, I mean, it's interesting. I had a case not too long ago. And I said, yeah, sometimes we do want to feel miserable. I mean, some days we might go, yeah, I'm just going to stay this way today. But I appreciated that because I think, sometimes we read books like this that it all sounds very like, oh, yeah, it's just always going to work. And I like the fact that there's this realness of, no, you might make a choice that's going to keep you in this path, but it's the choice that you make.
I mean, I wish we could claim credit for it. Marsha, when she was sort of developing the options to any problem, she named that there's essentially 4 options and a secret 5th one. 1, you can try to solve the problem. 2, you can tolerate it / accept it. 3, you can change how you think and feel about it. 4, you can stay miserable. listen, change is hard. Like all these things are hard. It makes sense when people want to stay miserable. And then there's like the secret fifth option, which is you can always make the situation worse.
Yeah.
That's also an option. And right to your point, like, doing this work is not easy. Like if it was easy, we wouldn't need this book. And we probably, we wouldn't have a profession. And so it makes sense why, people, I don't want to say choose misery. I guess what I would say is that people choose short-term relief over long-term gain because it's hard.
And the ability to feel empowered by the idea of choice as well as feeling intimidated by it. And I think when there can be that movement into the desire to reduce suffering, knowing that the choice is there, doesn't mean that it's necessarily easy, but that it is there, and being able to then have these steps in the process. And, I think another way that the book is such a valuable tool because it can help promote that and giving the pathways in a various way that does make it engaging and effective there.
Well, I appreciate you acknowledging that. I think it speaks to the fact that, DBT is based on a skills deficit model. And I sometimes take issue with, for instance, the diagnosis borderline personality disorder, because the idea that anyone's personality is somehow intrinsically disordered, well, it doesn't feel terribly dialectical to me. It doesn't recognize that who we are is so contextual, that change is constant, and that, intrinsically, none of us are any one thing. And so instead of seeing ourselves as these fixed beings moving through time, at times broken or unhealable, I think what has been really powerful for me as a DBT therapist and as a human is to think of myself as like, okay, there are aspects of my behavior where I have a skills deficit and there are ways that I'm skillful. And that orientation allows me to learn. It allows me to see that there's an opportunity for growth rather than hopelessness.
Jesse, kind of pulling kind of another maybe piece out of the book here. We just recently recorded an episode about social media and all of those things and how busy our lives are. And, I think often, we hear about, this idea that multitasking is very important and we're all doing all of these kind of different things. When in the book, when you talk about mindfulness, it's almost the opposite of that, right? It's opposite of multitasking. It's this idea of, one mindfully or something, where it's this idea of really just putting ourselves 100% into a single moment. And I guess I'd be curious if maybe you could talk a little bit to people about why in DBT, why that's important about kind of throwing ourselves 100% into that one moment and how that might help us when we do, live in a world that, gosh, as we're talking, my phone's dinging and all these other things are kind of happening. Maybe share a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Ray, I think about that one mindfully as a skill in particular a whole lot. I can't speak to, well, I guess I can because I grew up during a time without the iPhone or any phone. I don't want to, I have listeners, but without social media, there we go. Our brains are transacting with our environment. I think probably for many of us, our attentional capabilities are changing dramatically because of the technology, right? Yeah. There's always something now available to us to distract ourselves. And there are lots of things that are calling for our attention at all times, which I think, and I'm not going to say anything new here, has probably all sorts of profound, harmful effects for us. I think one of those effects is, Marcia has a saying that there's enough pain in the present moment. We don't need to go searching for it in the past or the future. And so I think one of the downsides of not being mindful is that we are not training our minds to return to the present. And so that allows for instance, a lot of rumination, that allows for a lot of returning to the past. I think about for instance, when I wake up at 2 a.m. and all of a sudden I'm filled with anxiety, I'm thinking about the worst things that can happen. In a previous iteration of my life, I think it would have been really easy for me to go into that to like sort of follow that road. Having learned these skills, having learned one mindfully, I'm pretty skillful at now noticing the thought and bringing myself back to the present. So that's really where like I have found for myself the benefit of that skill.
Yeah. And I was thinking about your earlier comment about the news, right? Like, so, I mean, we're bombarded, I almost see that skill as being such a great way to pull us back, right? To get us back to, there is a lot of stuff floating around out there and a lot of static, but that idea of just bringing it back 100% in one way. And I think it's so important, but I also, my experience is it's hard to get people there. Do you have, like, when you're working with people, how do you suggest that they start approaching that?
So, Ray, I think this is actually an example where dialectics is very helpful. I think that, and I, from some folks that I work with and sometimes myself, sometimes there can be the belief operating like, oh, if I'm not paying attention to the news, that means I'm not fully engaged. Or that means I'm not being active enough. I'm not doing enough. And like we can hold that, we can validate that there's truth in like, okay, by attending to the news, attending to these things, depending on your values and goals, can be really important. And to your point, when we spend all our time attending to that, we're missing out on other aspects of our life. And just because we are coming back to the present, that doesn't mean that you are someone that doesn't care about your community. It doesn't mean that you're someone who doesn't care about change. And so holding those two things, I can be present with myself, feel connected with others, and I can care and attend to the world around me is one sort of synthesis that I think gives us a bit more flexibility in terms of how we want to engage with that. Now, what I want to highlight is that recommendation there is built on the assumption that that's why someone is engaging with the news.
Right.
And I guess that goes to the bigger question is assessing the function of the behavior. But yeah, that's just an example.
Great.
And Jesse, I'm curious for you, like when you're talking about, these skills and like when they're being utilized, I don't hear it as something that is a constant utilization, but rather various iterations of ourselves as a very like kind of going into that synthesis. Like it's like we're just the next version of ourselves, but it's not something where it's like, oh, I'm necessarily having to live and breathe DBT, but rather when in the moment, when there is suffering or when there's these, evoked experiences, these are the skills that help me manage and help me be a better regulated through application. That long-term utilization can lead to, a trend where we are better synthesized, but I don't hear it necessarily as like this entirety of a mindset shift or, altering beliefs in its entirety, but rather being able to build the skill enough that we're just various iterations. Is that accurate though? Because again, I might be misinterpreting that.
No, it's a really interesting observation. I think that there's many ways that people, and that I myself, over time, by teaching, practicing the skill so much, I am kind of living and breathing it. And then I'm not always conscious. It's not always coming to my awareness that I'm practicing the skill. And Paul, to your point, like not every situation necessarily demands a DBT skill. And sometimes something comes to my awareness that I'm like, oh yes, like this is an opportunity to practice a skill. So I guess this is my easy answer out, is that it depends. And I think, it's fundamentally like, as Marcia also said, like the most compassionate thing I can do as a therapist is help you achieve your goals. It's whatever's going to be effective. If holding these skills in mind all the time is going to help you do what you need to do, fabulous. If learning the skills and just metabolizing them so they become second nature, that's going to help, fabulous.
Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
I was just going to I hear that then like, again, makes it even more accessible. And, because it doesn't have to then be, this is when your success is dictated by the individual utilizing it, not necessarily, from the outside perspective. And the outside perspective is wonderful for insight, or for building insight, but it doesn't necessarily dictate success in that way.
It's one of the things why I was so drawn to DBT. I think that there is a history of psychology and psychotherapy as being somewhat hierarchical. Like I, as a therapist, I'm going to know what's best. And DBT really disrupts that. And yeah, there are certain principles that we hold to. You can't do therapy if you're dead. Like I'm not going to, and fundamentally, it is your goals, your life worth living goals that are going to drive treatment that I'm going to help you achieve.
I have a list of probably 10 other things I want to talk about, but we're getting to the end. So I want to ask one more that was just something that stood out to me in the book that I want to just jump back to. In the book, you compare managing emotions to being a car mechanic. And one of the things that got me in that part is that you talk about secondary emotions. And so I think maybe an example like getting angry because you're ashamed or something of that nature. If you could maybe talk a little bit about, because I think sometimes, we do feel so many different things and there's all this, but you kind of talk in the book, I think, talk about why we shouldn't really kind of fix the secondary emotions, but instead really focus on the primary. I think maybe that's how I took it, or that we should focus on the primary. Can you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So in DBT, we have a model of emotions, basically a conceptualization of what an instance of an emotion is. And for many folks with what we would call emotion dysregulation, feel big emotions. Oftentimes when they feel something like fear, or to your point, like sadness, what have you, there might be an attendant judgment. Because I'm feeling fear, I am weak. Well, now we have what we call a primary emotion, and then all of a sudden that judgment thought has now turned this into a new instance of emotion, of one of shame, perhaps. And it is helpful for us to get to the primary emotion, because that's oftentimes the data that we need in order to, let's say, solve a problem or figure out what it is that we need to accept. So, for instance, if I'm walking down a dark alley and all of a sudden someone jumps out and I feel fear, if I suddenly think to myself, oh, I'm such a wuss for feeling fear, and I start feeling shame, well, I don't know how helpful that's going to be for me in that moment. So it's helpful to acknowledge, okay, there's some shame coming up, like, okay, and then to come back and listen to what is this other piece of information telling me? And sometimes that information doesn't always fit the facts, but at least now we've sort of decoupled it from some of the judgment that can intensify our distress, intensify our suffering.
So, as we're kind of almost kept you here an hour, and we don't want to take more of your time, but as we're kind of wrapping up, we usually ask two questions. I'm going to give you a bonus question. Congratulations. So I guess we'll go with my first one. My first kind of end question is always, if you can make a recommendation of a piece of content, anything you want, book, movie, anything you think our listeners should check out, what's something that you would recommend?
I would recommend How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett. A wonderful, brilliant, mind-altering distillation of emotional experiencing. There's a lot of misconceptions around what is happening when we experience an emotion. I think that there are many people who feel like emotions are something that get in the way of life, or they want to live life without an emotion. And she highlights a number of brilliant things. Namely, one of them is that like this experience of having an emotion, like it's just our body communicating information. It's just data. And so the question is, how do we begin to relate to that data effectively? So I would highly recommend. If you haven't read it, read it. It's fabulous. It will change your life.
Awesome. So my bonus question is, again, as I kind of read through the book, there's just so much kind of content, so many different skills. I guess I'm curious for you personally, which specific DBT skill do you find yourself relying on the most as you kind of navigate daily life and relationships and all that? Is there a skill that you lean on?
This is not the first time I've been asked this question, and it's so interesting because it changes.
Yeah.
And so the answer I'm going to give to you in this moment, it would maybe not be the same answer I would have given to you last week, but one that I continuously go back to is mindfulness of current emotions. And the skill of mindfulness of current emotions is attending to your emotion without trying to push it away, without holding on to it. It is simply riding the wave, observing your emotions. And there is this paradoxical experience that the more that we simply observe and allow an emotional experience, the easier it is to be with it. And oftentimes the faster it will go. So mindfulness of current emotions is a mainstay in my skills repertoire.
It's where you're leaning at the moment.
It's where I'm leaning at the moment.
Yeah.
Not at this moment, but in other moments.
But I kind of love that. And I'm so glad you qualified that, because I think that's, again, the elegance, right? Like that we may be leaning on certain ones at certain times. And with our lived experience, those things are going to change. And we may need something else, but it's, if we have the tools, we can pull out the right one when we need it. And it doesn't have to be, this is the one I use all the time. It is the kind of beauty of it, I think. So I appreciate your qualification of that. So last question that we ask everyone, if you could take and give us 3 takeaways or kind of gems that you want our listeners to remember about either this conversation, or even I'd extend maybe something from the book if we haven't talked about it today, and I hope they'll pick that up. But 3 takeaways you'd like people to walk away with.
Okay. I'm going to try to be succinct. 1, dovetailing on what I said earlier, emotions, they're data. You don't need to get rid of them. And in fact, getting rid of them would only cause you as a futile effort. Begin to relate to your emotions as information. 2, suffering is universal. You are not alone in this experience. We all experience pain. We all experience loss. We all experience fears. You're not alone in that experience. And that goes to number 3, because these experiences have been felt by millions of others. We psychologists, scientists have developed a number of skills and interventions which have been found to be effective at reducing our suffering, some of which can be found in this book.
That's great. And I really do hope our listeners check out the book. I mean, I looked at it as I read it as a great resource to share with people I work with in therapy. So I know it's written kind of more in a fashion that's not necessarily a therapy tool, but it's a great therapy tool. So I appreciate it as well. So, real skills for real life, a DBT guide to navigating stress, emotions, and relationships. So hopefully everyone checks it out. And Jesse, thanks for joining us at the end of your work day. We appreciate you spending time with us.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you so much.
Just to echo that, truly thank you so much. And, if you're interested in checking out the book, look down in the show notes and we'll have a link there for you. And, Jesse, thank you for spending a Thursday evening here. And for listeners who are interested in learning more or following, what you have going on, is there any way any place they can go to stay up to date?
Yeah, I'm in private practice. You can find me at Axis CBT. That's not DBT, it's CBT. I just want to say DBT is a type of CBT, .com. So axiscbt.com. I am somewhat active on Instagram. You can follow me at Talk is Good. And then my colleague, Shireen Rizvi, to see all the amazing things that she is up to. And I think that covers it.
We'll certainly hope you at home are taking that time to check this out. And if you're a licensed clinician who would like to use this information, please head over to www.psych2practice.com or check our show notes for a link to purchase an accompanying exam for continuing education units for this episode. If you're interested in hearing more and staying up to date with what's going on for Psych2Practice, you can visit our website or follow us on all major social media by searching Psych2Practice. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, be well and stay psyched.